Hello and welcome to meeting 2 of the California Long-Term Care Facility Access Policy Workgroup. My name is Hetty Lim with the California Department of Aging, and I'll be kicking off this meeting today. Throughout the meeting, my team will be in the background answering any Zoom technical questions. If you experience any difficulties during the session, please type your question into the Q&A, which is located on the Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen. The chat panel is also available for comments and feedback. We'll provide additional information on that shortly. During today's event, live closed captioning will be available in 11 languages. We are also joined by an American Sign Language interpreter who will be providing live translation throughout today's meeting. The LTCFA Policy Workgroup's purpose: we are commissioned by the California Legislature. The Long-Term Care Facility Access Policy Workgroup will develop recommendations for policies and practices regarding access and visitation to long-term care facilities during states of emergency, with consideration for the impact that restricted access has on mental health of residents, families, and friends, on the physical health and safety of residents. CDA is committed to ensuring an open, transparent, and accessible process. All workgroup meetings will be held publicly and are subject to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. All meetings and deliberations of this workgroup will be made available to the public, and members of the public will have an opportunity to provide comments at every meeting. Meeting information, agendas, and materials from past meetings will be available on the following webpage. We can post that webpage into the chat if we need to. For workgroup members, verbal comments, workgroup members may raise their hand in the reactions feature of Zoom to enter the line for a verbal comment or question. At multiple points throughout the meeting, CDA will take comments or questions from the workgroup members in line, and members can unmute themselves. For written comments, workgroup members may submit their comments and questions throughout the meeting using the Zoom chat. Workgroup members should send their comments to everyone. There's a little drop down for it. All comments will be recorded and reviewed by CDA staff. For members of the public, verbal comments, CDA will take public comments at designated times during the meeting and as indicated in the meeting agenda. Workgroup members may raise their hand in the reactions feature of Zoom or press *9 on their phone to dial pad to enter the line for verbal comments or questions. For written comments, members of the public may submit their comments and questions throughout the meeting using the Zoom Q&A. All comments will be recorded and reviewed by CDA staff. So we'll start with a welcome, roll call, and background. Continue on to a summary of meeting number 1, learnings from research and lived experience. Following with actionable principles for LTCF visitation, and closing with public comment and closing and next steps.
Thank you. I will take it over from here. Thank you. My name is Brandy Duvall, and welcome to the Long-Term Care Facility Access Workgroup meeting number 2. As Hetty noted, this is the second of 4 meetings of this workgroup, which means that the meeting today will take us halfway through our work together. We've been reminded of the work group's purpose. We've looked at the agenda, and I'd like to start by recapping some background on the work group's task, including our scope and plan for each of the work group's 4 meetings. Then we will share key learnings gathered from the research and lived experiences shared by residents and their loved ones during meeting number 1. The bulk of today's discussion will be on actionable principles for visitation. We will take comments throughout the discussion today, and we will also have a dedicated comments period for the public, and this will happen at the end of our meeting. I would now like to introduce my colleagues who will be presenting throughout our meeting today. First, we have Mark Beckley, Chief Deputy Director at CDA, and we have Juliet Mullen, Senior Manager for Manat Health. On this slide is a full list of organizations and their representatives participating in the work group. On our website, we have posted a list of all the representatives and their biographies. A member of our team will drop that link in the chat now. You can go there and check out all the bios. This document will include the work group bios that were already submitted to CDA. If you haven't done that, it's not too late. Please send us your bio and we will add it to this document. At this time, I would like to invite the work group members to make use of the chat. Just introduce yourselves, let us know you're here. Maybe drop your name, title, and the organization that you're from. Oh, great. Great. Welcome, Eric, Jason, Melody. They're coming in fast now. Thank you so much for that. So please continue to introduce yourselves. I'm going to move on to the next slide while you all do that. So before we review the scope and plan for work group meetings, it is important to remind ourselves of what this work group has been tasked to do. This work group has been tasked with bringing together diverse perspectives from across the state and building on learnings from the COVID-19 public health emergency. The long-term care facility access work group will develop recommendations for access and visitation policies for future states of emergency. The California Department of Aging shall submit the recommendations of the work group to the fiscal and appropriate policy committees of the legislature. As far as the scope overview, in developing recommendations, the work group members will evaluate the impact of restricted access on the mental health of residents, families, and friends, and on the physical health and safety of residents, and consider a range of the following. So visitors, and we have some examples there, friends, family, chosen family, and the list of examples goes on. Long-term care facilities, including SNFs and ICFs, ARFs, and those are also listed there by example. And then types of emergencies, pandemics, and more natural disasters, bioterrorism, things like that. So take just a second to read that. Okay. As a reminder, the long-term care facility access work group will engage in a total of 4 meetings, and the meetings will build upon each other. In meeting 1, we focused on research, the lived experience of work group members and the public, and existing state policies on long-term care facility access and visitation during the COVID-19 public health emergency. Building on those learnings, today's meeting will focus on identifying actionable principles for visitation and future emergencies. During meetings 3 and 4, we will identify specific policy and practice recommendations for future emergencies for each actionable principle. The meeting objective of today's discussion is to identify actionable principles for long-term care facility visitation in future states of emergency. We will do that by recapping the learnings from meeting 1 and identifying actionable principles related to the following. First, how to achieve a balance of visitation rights and public health protections, how to ensure visitation rights and public health protections are implemented equitably, and finally, how to address regional variation to ensure equitable implementation of visitation rights and public health protections. Now I will turn it over to Mark Beckley, who will be discussing the learnings from meeting 1.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandy. And thank you all for attending today's meeting 2 of the Long-Term Care Facilities Access Workgroup. We really appreciate your active participation on this workgroup. Before launching into the learnings from meeting 1, I'd like to take some time to thank all of you for your engagement up until this point. I'd like to particularly thank those speakers in the last meeting who shared with us their experiences on visiting or attempting to visit loved ones in long-term care facilities during the COVID pandemic. We do recognize that many of these topics, including those raised today, can be very personal in nature and are not always easy to discuss. In today's meeting, there will be a variety of views shared from the public health perspective and options that California may want to consider regarding visitation during natural and public health emergencies. Today, we want to continue to have an active and healthy conversation on this topic and continue to do so in a respectful and productive manner. I also want to note that State Department representatives will be mainly in listening mode to actively listen to the perspectives of the stakeholders on this work group and from the public, but they may weigh in from time to time to provide additional background or additional information on this topic. Next slide. Okay, so with that in mind, we'll begin by reminding everyone of the key topics discussed during meeting 1, which was held on March 13th. And these focused on research on long-term care facility visitation and access policies, the lived experience of long-term care visitation, and a preliminary overview of long-term care facility visitation policies in the United States. A reminder again that the summary of and links to research articles and the state statutes that were referenced in the last meeting can be accessed on the workgroup website. So please feel free to refer to those to either refresh yourselves or to find additional information on this topic. Okay, next slide. From our discussion in meeting 1, 4 key themes emerged. 1, family, friends, chosen family, and other individuals, including those not employed by long-term care facilities, provide care and support for residents that is essential for their health and well-being. 2, that it is difficult to understand visitation guidance and rights, given all the different agencies and departments involved in establishing visitation policies. 3, that implementation and enforcement of visitation guidance was inconsistent, fostering disparities in access to visitation. And finally, challenges with facility infrastructure, staff shortages, and limited staff training exacerbated a pre-existing digital divide for long-term care facility residents. The following slides will outline the specific learnings from the research and the lived experiences shared with the work group to illustrate how these key themes impact visitation. And if you have any additional thoughts or takeaways from meeting one, please feel free to drop those either in the Q&A or the chat as I walk through them today. Okay, next slide. So as previously stated, the first theme was that family, friends, chosen family, and other individuals provide care and support for residents that is essential for their health and well-being. I won't read through this entire slide, but I will highlight a few key findings. One, that social contact is essential in preventing residents' social isolation and loneliness. And we recognize that several workgroup members shared how their loved ones experienced serious declines in physical and mental health during periods of restricted visitation. Two, research underscores the contributions of family and friends who provide frontline care when they visit residents of long-term care facilities. And finally, visitors who do not work for long-term care facilities have an important role in identifying issues with resident health and well-being and advocating for care for their loved ones, as we heard from several workgroup members in the last meeting. Next slide. The second learning from the workgroup members and members of the public was how difficult it was for most stakeholders, including residents and loved ones, to understand visitation guidance and rights, given all of the different agencies and departments involved in establishing visitation policy. And although many different levels of government agencies provide guidance and establish regulations related to long-term care facility visitation, there is no single source of information for members of the public to understand the current guidance and rules governing long-term care facility access and visitation rights for their specific long-term care facility. And finally, facilities do not consistently provide clear and publicly accessible information about the facility's policies governing visitation access. And we do understand that during the COVID pandemic, there were sometimes frequent changes to state and local policies, but we are trying to figure out a way to get the information from the facilities on a consistent and clear basis. Okay, next slide. For the third learning, a related but distinct challenge to the previous learning is that implementation and enforcement of visitation guidance was inconsistent, fostering disparities in access to visitation. Some workgroup members provided examples of situations where facilities did not appear to adhere to existing guidance from the state. And then some workgroup members also provided examples of situations where they were unsuccessful raising issues with facilities' adherence to guidance. Next slide. And the last theme that was identified is that challenges with facility infrastructure, staffing shortages, and limited staff training exacerbated a pre-existing digital divide. Several workgroup members expressed challenges with using technology to communicate with their loved ones during restricted visitations, such as facilities that did not have sufficient technology to support televisits between residents and loved ones, facilities that had staffing constraints that may have contributed to a lack of support for residents in using virtual visit technologies. And finally, facilities that did not have staff with knowledge or training to assist residents with televisits. So that's a summary of the key themes and learnings from the last meeting. I'll now turn it over to Juliet, who will give us who will present the discussion on actionable principles for long-term care facility visitation.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. If you go to the next slide. So as Mark noted and Brandy previewed at the top of our meeting today, our focus today is going to be really outlining actionable principles for long-term care visitation. Mark just reviewed all of the core takeaways from, well, many of the core, maybe not all, and so we invite folks to chime in the chat if there are other big takeaways from your perspective. But Mark just reviewed kind of core takeaways from our discussion of the research and the lived experience and the existing state policies. And this is really our foundational conversation around the learnings that we can build upon. Today, what we're going to do is really build on those learnings and start to map out what this work group recommends that the state of California do going forward in future states of emergency. So if we could go to the next slide. And so in thinking about kind of the entire goal of today's conversation, we're really focused on this concept of how might we achieve balance in visitation policies. And so there's really the core way that we are thinking about this across the work group is really thinking about how we balance preserving individual rights to physical, mental health support, advocacy, and autonomy. And these are all really core themes and important issues that we heard raised from the work group. And then how do we balance that kind of on the other end of the scale with the protecting public health and make sure that we're achieving balance across those two concepts. So we're really going to be very focused today in talking through how we do that. You'll see kind of on the bottom of this visual, we are going to spend the kind of back half of our conversation today, or the end of our discussion today, focused on once we talk through how we want to achieve that balance, talking through how we ensure that that balance is equitably implemented and that both visitation rights and public health protections are equitably implemented, and then how we address any regional factors that might impact rights and public health protections. But for the first core section of our conversation, will be focused up here in the top in achieving that balance. We'll start on the left-hand side of this diagram and look at how we might preserve individual rights to physical, mental health support, advocacy, and autonomy, and then we'll go into public health protection. So if we go to the next slide. So as we've kind of already teed up in a number of ways, our discussion objective today is actionable principles. We're going to start with visitation rights, then go into public health safety. We'll talk through equitable implementation, and then we'll discuss regional factors that affect implementation. We go to the next slide. So discussion one. So here we're going to really dive into how might we preserve individual rights to physical, mental health, advocacy, and autonomy. And talk through different strategies and ways in which we might ensure that we're protecting that right. As with every section we're going to talk through today, we're going to start by defining the issue. What are we making sure we solve for? What are we making sure we prevent? What are the situations that we're concerned about that we want to make sure that we're putting forward recommendations to address? With this first section, we actually spent a lot of time in our first work group meeting defining this issue. And so what we've done here is we've taken a first pass at summarizing the issue as we heard it from the research, as we heard it from the lived experience, as we heard it from all the different members of the work group that shared their very personal stories and experiences with visitation and what happened when it was restricted. So here we've identified kind of four major ways in which we heard from this work group issues when facility access is restricted. The first, and we've listed these out A, B, C, D, so folks can kind of chime in on them in the chat by easily referencing the letter. The first is that loved ones are not able to provide important care, social connection, and advocacy for long-term care facility residents, which can worsen mental and physical health. So Mark spoke to that quite a bit, and we heard a lot about this from the work group when we talked about it in March. This concept of not being able to really meet the mental and physical health needs of your loved ones and be there for them to provide advocacy and important care. A second major thing we heard from the work group is that residents are not able to be with their loved ones specifically during moments of crisis. And that might include end of life. It might include transitions between facilities, for example. It might include loss of a loved one, so experiencing grief. It might include situations where the resident is experiencing kind of really severe eating and drinking issues and may not be eating and drinking, or moments of acute need for mental health support. So that was a very big area where we heard kind of a really big issue arising when you restrict access to a facility. For C, we heard folks talk about the importance of participating in off-site events. So being able not just to have people come on-site to see you if you're a resident, but also be able to go off-site and participate in the life of your family and loved ones and be able to do things, for example, like attend funerals, birthdays, weddings. Those can be things that are impacted when access to a facility is restricted. And then the final core one we really pulled out from the conversation in March is that residents are not able to receive services that are not provided by long-term care facility staff when facility access is restricted. And that can include things like healthcare needs that cannot be provided by the facility, or care management or social services. And it can also be situations like getting, haircuts or dentist visits, things like that. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm actually going to invite folks to chime in on this list, because we'd really like to make sure that we have a good definition of the issues that we're endeavoring to address with these recommendations before we start to talk about what we want to recommend. And this is not a mutually exclusive list. This is not pick one. This may be all of them, but would love to hear from folks. I think, first of all, which of these issues really come out to them, and the answer can be all four. That's fine. I just saw that answer in the chat, in fact. And then we also want to understand if this is missing anything really important. So I'm going to open it up to folks in the chat to chime in, and then I'm going to invite members of the work group to raise their hand and share their thoughts verbally here. And I'm looking at the chat. I'll just chime in a little bit on what I'm seeing. And actually, I'll read the first one, and then I see she has her hand raised. So we'll go there. Nancy Stevens is pointing out, I wish there was a 1, 2, and 3 listed under advocacy. So would love to hear more on that. And I see you have your hand raised, Nancy. So please feel free to unmute yourself and share your thoughts.
Yeah, so certainly under advocacy, for instance, in my personal situation, I was told I was not allowed to record or take photographs of things like someone else's feces being put next to my bed, where my feet stepped down so that I couldn't get out of bed. So just as an example, I do wish that there were a 1, 2, and 3 under advocacy,
And
so that it can be more detailed.
Yeah, and so I'm hearing you say there's a concept of, it's not just like, can you be in the building? It's also, what can you do when you're in the building? Yeah.
Yes.
Around the advocacy piece. That's great. Thank you. Other folks have additions here or want to chime in and add like another layer to what's on this slide?
This is Todd Higgins from Disability Rights California. I apologize, I couldn't find my raise hand function. But I think also one thing that I saw was also residents being able to go home for family visits and then return to the facility, and I think that became an issue. So it's not technically a visitation to the facility issue, but it is an issue that I think kind of falls into this category. If folks agree with that.
And this is just to be, I want to make sure I heard that right. This is saying people were not able to do that during.
Correct. Not allowed.
Yes.
Not allowed to leave for family visits and then return to the facility.
Yep. And Karen, I see you've raised your hand.
I just want to clarify. So I definitely think all 4 of these need to be included. But one thing that needs to at least be a subset of this is what happens when a resident, is able to do those things and possibly, well, with COVID, maybe be exposed to COVID and then coming back into the facility and, possibly creating a harm. So I'm not against people going out. I mean, actually, I'm very, very for it, or having access to everybody, but we do need to talk about how that, affects everyone. And as Todd kind of alluded to, the quarantine issues, it almost became a punishment to residents who did exercise any of their rights to leave during COVID, that then they, for a while, it was like 2 to 3 weeks of quarantine if they wanted to go out once. And that, there was even a time when, the folks on dialysis were concerned and they were kind of being punished for being on dialysis. So that needs to be addressed in the policy.
Thank you for that. And I think maybe that takes us into our next set of slides. I'm hearing generally in the chat a lot of alignment with what's on this slide and these core issues being really important issues we want to make sure that we're addressing in recommendations. I'm seeing some recommendations to add and emphasize notes like on the first one, that also providing communication support in addition to social connection, advocacy, and care is a big piece there. So I think all of this is great. And I think I'm hearing both in the comments and in the chat specifically on C, not limiting C to something that's a funeral or a wedding or a birthday. But I see one person in the chat noting that just being able to get out and get fresh air and then being able to visit family as well. So I think it sounds like this is, this is capturing the major issues, and then we're emphasizing and adding some dimensions to these issues. But I think with that in mind, we may be able to move to the next piece, which you were starting to speak to, Karen, which is how do you actually define these things and how do you make sure you do these things safely and you think about all the implications and the parameters behind it. So what we've done on the next 4 slides is we've taken each of these 4 issues and we've sort of broken out, let's understand the issue a little bit more deeply and would love to hear folks' kind of additional thoughts on ways to understand this issue. And then what we've done is we've pulled out how either other states have approached this or some options we may have heard from the work group in the first meeting, and just listed out some ways that this work group could recommend to the state of California to address this issue. So for this, and we'll just have a conversation on each. So for this first issue, which is the issue of ensuring that you have access to the facility so that loved ones and chosen family can provide care, social connection, advocacy. I'm going to add communication support that we just heard to residents in the facility. So one of the core ways that states have ensured this right and built in this right is through this concept that we talked about in meeting 1 of the essential caregiver or essential support person or support person. Different states call it different things. But it's functionally a concept where an individual resident in the facility or one of their representatives can designate an individual who will have access to the facility and be able to provide that care, social connection, communication support, and advocacy. Generally speaking, the essential caregiver is defined as an individual who provides in-person visits that are necessary for the physical, emotional, and social well-being of the resident or patient. That individual is generally selected by the resident or their representatives. And I will note, and actually this is just in line with what I just saw get dropped in the chat, some laws specify specifically that though the term may be caregiver, there's no requirement that the person deliver, frontline care to meet that criteria. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, and I would actually love to hear from the work group. I think now we're starting to try to get into what do we specifically want to recommend. And so this would be one option for how the work group might address this issue specifically of making sure that residents have access to the care, social connection, communication support, and advocacy they need, would be to recommend a similar policy where residents can designate someone who will, or multiple people who will have access to them in the facility. I'm going to open it up for feedback and whether this is an approach that this work group would recommend for California. So I'm just going to read out what I'm seeing. Oh, actually, I see some hands raised. We'll go there first. Ellen, I see you have your hand raised. Please.
Yes, thank you. One of the challenges I have with this is the different types of disasters that we're looking at. And I think different elements will apply depending upon whether it is a pandemic versus something wrong with the infrastructure of the building.
Yeah.
So I think that's just one of the struggles I have when I look at this is something's wrong with the building. Of course, you want the essential person to be able to come in. And I think that person is extremely important. But during a pandemic, such as what we went through, it was difficult to make exclusions when we were in the midst of a real crisis. So I don't know how to tease that out, but I think it would be different requirements depending upon the issue at hand, the disaster.
That's a great point. And I thank you for raising that, Ellen, because we are really endeavoring to think about a broad range of public health, of not even necessarily public health, of states of emergency that could include a fire, for instance, or a fire emergency in a county. And so we want to think that through. Part of that, I think we'll get to a little bit when we dive into options for making sure that we have the tools in place for protecting public health and protecting the public. But thank you for raising that, because it does make these decision points complicated. We're not thinking, this is not a particular recommendation for COVID-19 in 2022. This is a recommendation for the future in a future state of emergency that's not necessarily defined in this moment. Thanks for raising that. Nancy, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Juliet. I think something that's missing here is spiritual well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So having a connection to one's congregation or faith-based group is important as well.
That's great. Thank you for that addition. And I see, so Karen in the chat has commented about a recommendation, and I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, Karen, that if you have a situation where there is an essential caregiver designation and that's the only person that can come in to see the resident, that be time bound. Am I getting that correctly, Karen?
Yeah, so my point is, I don't think there should only be one person designated, but if the crisis is so bad that there has to be some limitations and you can't have all of your support people, that they would be time limited, very short time limited, and that could be one person. But after that time period is over, then you should be able to have access to all of your support people, or a significantly higher number, not one person for 3 years or whatever that might be. That's horrifically not, it's better, but it's not much better than having one.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Karen. Maitli, I see you raised your hand.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm trying to wrap my head around that suggestion. So during normal times when we're not in a pandemic that locked us down for 2 years, you're saying that, so during normal times, residents have rights to their family members and friends, and it's up to them. During a pandemic like what we are still sort of experiencing, where it may last for more than 30 days or more than a year, and lockdowns are just recurring, you're saying that they have to alternate people, or they have to open it up to other people. My question is because some people only have one person. So it's, I wouldn't want it to be confused for the ability to stop those visits, or even maybe in a situation where it is unsafe to let the whole family in at that stage, to invite the entire family in. I'm trying to understand exactly what the parameters of that suggestion are.
So to clarify, my point is, I don't think we should make people pick and choose their loved ones who can come and visit. And if they must pick and choose, it should be only for a short time, and then it gets opened up again. I had so many clients during COVID that had to decide between their adult daughter, who was, a really good advocate for them, or their husband of 50 years. And they could only have one for some period of time, even though we didn't have this law in California. And it wasn't fair to the resident to have to make that choice, or to the family to say, well, sorry, you guys cannot be here. So if there must be a limit for some reason. It should be very limited time, and it should not extend past some basic amount of time. And I continue to have issues with saying if PPE will protect the residents, you know, from the staff, why wouldn't it not? And there's multiple staff in those buildings every day. Why wouldn't it protect them from multiple family members? It doesn't make scientific sense.
Thank you. Yeah, agreed.
Nancy, I see you raised your hand.
Yes, I agree with all of these things. Speaking for my neighbors and other residents throughout the state of California, I do hope that all of these suggestions will be taken into strong consideration.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome. I just say that because I'm the only resident on the member group. So thanks.
And we appreciate you very much taking the time to participate and share that. Thank you. I'm looking through the chat as I'm tracking. So I'm seeing in the chat some general alignment that if you're limiting significantly to a very small number of essential caregivers, there should be some time boundedness in that limitation. So if an emergency lasts 3 years, as a hypothetical scenario, if emergency lasts 3 years, we would not want to recommend that it would be okay to have only one person able to access the resident over a 3-year window. So it may be a recommendation that either says that the number needs to be higher beyond a certain amount of time, and you can only limit to one person for a brief window. Something to that effect. Great. And I think I'm seeing a lot in the chat about, you know, fundamentally being in a mindset of how might we enable visitation, and understanding that there are situations where there are public health considerations. How do we create some crisp definition and time boundedness around that so that we are ensuring that we are enabling visitation? I'm seeing kind of a few different types of comments reflecting that in the chat. Catherine, I see you've raised your hand.
Thank you. I guess I just wanted to loop back about the notion of limiting the number of what you're calling caregivers. And it's not intuitive to me about why we would start with a rule that would say it's okay to limit the number as opposed to people designate people. And if there was going to be some change, there has to be something specific that happened that would result in a need to limit the numbers. Because if as is said in the chat, there's PPE being used and it's the same requirements that staff have, given the number of staff that come in and out of facilities, it's a little difficult to understand why a resident could only have one caregiver that was a family member as opposed to 2. And so I'm not comfortable starting from a place that says it's okay to limit the number of individuals. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I'm going to open that up to the work group and see what folks think about that. Karen, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I just want to say, I also agree. I think if we could have recommendations that start with don't limit, protect, you know, using whatever methods are available, that would probably be the best way to do it. And then if protections must be put in place that exceed that, then we would start looking at these limitations that still protect their rights. But no limitation should be in there if there's a way to, if staff can be in those facilities, families can be in those facilities. It just doesn't make sense otherwise.
And I'm apologizing. I don't know how to say your first name. Leza? Or
Lisa. Yeah.
Lisa. Okay, Lisa.
There you go. I feel very strongly that there shouldn't be a limit. These are not criminals. These are people that are in these homes, and they should be given the rights that those of us that are in homes. We start to really tread into this world of being very paternalistic and what's in their best interest, instead of asking them what is their expressed wish. There were too many residents that would have rather died 9 months earlier having got COVID, but having held the hands of their loved ones. And I think many of us on this still have some post-traumatic stress of having those phone calls where we're trying to keep people safe when maybe it isn't my job to be everybody's, I don't think I am instilled with the right to say what is in their best interest. I'm trying to advocate for them using common sense. And so if it's safe enough for the residents, if it's safe enough for staff to be in there, then I feel like it has to be safe enough for family members. Because I think in some ways, the family members took more precautions and were more careful than some of the staff. Not all staff, certainly lots of staff were very, very diligent, and I do not want to be in any way disparaging on the staff. They did amazing jobs. But as it was mentioned in the comments, many staff work in multiple facilities, and we watched COVID crossing over. We don't have many family members that have family in multiple facilities. So thank you.
Thank you. Jack, you're next in line.
Yes, just really echoing something in the chat. I think, I agree with that patients should be able to identify as many family members or support people that they choose to. And I'm hoping that we're in agreement with that. And we're just talking about some of the more practical concerns in terms of limiting how many people you can have in there at any one time. So I'm all for people having a list of 1 to a list of a dozen, but for all intents and purposes, is it practical to have a dozen people come in at once? So I'm just kind of echoing something that's already been put in the chat and really offering nothing new, but just kind of want to redirect in that way and just say, I don't think the limitation issue is on 2 levels, and I don't think I think we're all kind of in agreement that patients should be able to have some latitude in naming the number of people that they choose to be essential providers.
That's a really helpful distinction, not limiting who you can name. You could have a very broad list, but thinking about like the logistics of you can have X number at a time for operational reasons, safety reasons, et cetera. I want to note before I go to the next in line, I am seeing some comments about compassionate care. Our next slide and our next topic will be diving into the compassionate care right issue. And we'll kind of look at that as a particular set of issues as well in just a moment. So I just wanted to flag that for folks in the chat that are starting to talk about that. Jaylene, next.
Hi, my comments were going to be very much in line with Jack Light's comments, but just providing those options, especially during a public health emergency, that you can respond appropriately. Some facilities have people sharing rooms and they're too crowded if all caregivers are in the room. So just thinking that kind of thing through during the particular emergency. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Karen, you raise your hand.
I just wanted to also respond, and I don't think necessarily we're saying that 12 or 15 or 30 people should visit at once. We're just saying that you shouldn't have to pick between your kids and your husband or your niece who came into town and hasn't otherwise been able to see you. But certainly it can be limited to how many people are physically present at a time. It just needs to be more than just only your daughter for 3 years or only your whoever for 3 years.
So I'm hearing some consensus around being able to, first of all, I just want to, and folks, if If what I'm about to say is totally not in line with how you're thinking about this, please drop this in the chat, because I want to make sure I'm summarizing what I'm hearing so far. I'm hearing a lot of consensus around having a recommendation for California to adopt a essential caregiver support person approach. We can decide which of those terms we think is appropriate, in which residents could name potentially as many people as they want to that list. We'll talk in a moment about perhaps what types of precautions those people agree to take, but the name whoever they want to that list. And then we'd essentially be saying, you know, in a state of emergency, a facility can, for example, limit the location of the visit. I saw some comments in the chat about shared rooms, for example. So there might be some ability for sites to say it should happen in one location or the other. Or perhaps the number who are there at one particular time, but not to say you can only have one person for a year. It can be rotating people coming in and out, and that there's you can enumerate a broad list of people who could come. I see a few hands raised. This is great. Nancy?
Yes, I agree with everything you just said, Juliet. Thank you so much for making due mention of that. I also wanted to go back a second and just also mention that my essential caregivers who were allowed to come in under compassionate care at one point were also here to make sure to gently remind staff to wear their PPE, because every single day during the pandemic, I had staff inside my room caring for me, as well as for my roommate at that time, who were not donning PPE at all. And I actually had pushback from some senior management personnel as well who refused to wear their PPE. So.
Thank you for raising that, Nancy. That really important advocacy and raising issues for the resident like that. It's very critical. Blanca?
Hi, so California always is the one that does things is a little different. So I appreciate that we're looking at other state laws, but I do feel that we need to create one for California specific. So I was glad to hear there was a recommendation or an acknowledgement that there's people who need translators, somebody that understands their language. I just wanted to underscore that I hear a lot of the stakeholders and work panel members talking about, thanks for summarizing what we heard. So I agree with everything you pointed out, and also just underscore that during the pandemic and even today, we continue to see a shortage of staff in facilities. And many family members and caregivers were handling some of the tasks that staff would ordinarily handle. And so I think that it's just something we should include in our recommendations, or acknowledging that they do play a very significant role as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanca. Karen?
I wanted to address the where part of that. I had a lot of clients who couldn't leave their room, and their family couldn't, so that because they couldn't leave their room for various health reasons, the family, if there was a visiting area, it wouldn't work. And, especially when we have places in California where winter is really awful, you wouldn't want to have an outside visit at that point in time. So we need to make sure that the where is also addressed in the recommendations, because that can be a hugely limiting factor. And I'll tell you, I had one, I think I may have mentioned this before, one client, I mean, several, but two residents, neither one of them particularly mobile, in the same room. And one of the residents who didn't want to leave the room also didn't want visits in the room, and his family didn't want visits in the room because COVID was scary, and it still is. But that limited when the wife could visit her husband, who also had mobility issues, and it was hard for him to leave the room because it was really rare that he could be out of the room enough at the same time she could visit. And so we can't let roommates stop visits, but we have to figure out a way to do a recommendation that honors their wishes too. But you can't be, if you can leave the room, but you choose not to, that you can stop a visit. And that was a big issue, and a lot of the guidance was that, you know, if there was another roommate in the room, you couldn't have the visit in the room. And that was kind of unfair. If you had a more open family, you could visit, but if you didn't, you couldn't. And again, that it's not a very fair way to make the decision about whether you can see your loved one or not.
Thank you for raising that. Yep. Todd, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. So I just wanted to address a concern with the word essential caregiver. I think when you put the word essential with it, it leaves it up to subjective interpretation. You know, and as far as, you know, what, you know, anyway, I think I would prefer to see just the word essential being dropped from the policy, because again, I think it just opens it up to more subjective interpretation, or limiting what essential means to a person.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. And I do want to preview for folks in our third meeting. What we'll do is we'll take these principles, this general alignment we have on what we want to recommend for this work group, and then we'll start to finesse, what are we going to call it? What are, you know, where we have particular parameters that we're putting in place or recommending for anything, what exactly do those look like? So I encourage everyone to think about that one specifically. If you have thoughts now on what the language is that would be appropriate for this, certainly welcome that. But we'll definitely make sure we spend some time on that, Todd, in our next conversation, because that's an important one. Great. Lisa.
Thank you. I am very cautious about the notion of these visits having to occur in certain places, because we've already discussed that loved ones can be providing essential services. So if we've now decided that I can only meet with my mom in this area, does that mean I rub my mother's back in this now public area? What if she wants me to, you know, undo her bra because her shoulders are really hurting her? I think we are going to be in conflict if we're saying this, that there are certain areas of the building that are okay for visits, if we've already acknowledged that loved ones are providing essential services. So I think we're going to get ourselves into conflict there. And then I'm going to go back. If PPE is safe for staff, PPE is safe for families.
Thank you. We have a hand raised. I don't, the person's just named long-term care facility access member, so I'm not sure who it is, but if you would like to take yourself off mute. They've dropped their hand. Okay, so I think on this piece, we have some pretty good alignment with this group, and encourage people to drop in the chat if anything I'm about to say you don't agree with, that we are recommending some kind of approach to be named that would mirror the concept of being able to designate individuals who can come visit you in the facility. And that to the extent that that there would not necessarily be a limit to the number of individuals you can name. There may be considerations in an emergency for the number who can be on site at a given time. But that you could theoretically name 12 loved ones and they could come visit you if there was a simultaneous visitor limitation on a rotating basis, something to that effect. All right. I'm seeing general agreement with that. I'm seeing a lot of comments about the public health protections that we would recommend in terms of PPE and things like that. And we're going to come to that a little bit later in our conversation today. But I think, you know, we are at the 1 hour mark and we have our first core principle that we want to recommend moving forward, which is to move forward with this general approach. And we'll spend some more time defining that later in today's conversation and then in our subsequent conversations as well. So we have our first big principle aligned upon with this work group, which is great. Let's go to our next slide. So now we wanted to take some time, and I alluded as folks were talking about this in the chat, that we would take a moment to talk specifically about the issue of compassionate care as a potentially distinct thing that we want to put some recommendations forward around from moments that would not be considered moments of crisis, for example. And so what this might look like, and has looked like in certain states, is that in a moment that is appropriate for compassionate care situations, and those can be defined very broadly based on the state. It can include transitions, grief, end of life, a lot of other situations. In those particular moments when compassionate care is needed, to have an elevated right to, or a distinct right to visitation during that time, because it is a moment of crisis. So, especially in the context of the conversation we just had about kind of like what we would recommend as more baseline visitation, would love to invite this group to speak to what are situations in which California may recommend a different set of rights or visitation in a situation of compassionate care. And so I see we have a couple hands raised. The first hand raised does not have a name, it's long-term care facility access member, but if you know who you are and you know you have your hand raised, I invite you to take yourself off mute.
Liz Fuller, I'm not sure why
Right.
I'm named this, but I ask that I think that I'm supportive of everything that everyone has said, but I don't think it's all that different than what some of what was in a bill previously. And so what I'd love for us to kind of consider is what is our dream, and then what would be our line in the sand. And that helps in what the recommendations are. That's not to say that the recommendations aren't the dream and the hope as we move forward. But what would be reasonable in moving through the legislature, because what was thought to be reasonable is a lot of what is discussed here, in fact, even greater, but wasn't moved through the legislature. And so I would hate for us to only have the recommendations that are kind of the dream, but not having discussed what our line in the sand is, because we may have to ultimately build off that line as we move forward.
Thank you for that comment, Liz. Perhaps before we move into a robust conversation about compassionate care, we can go back to essential caregiver for a moment. I think we've heard from folks what we want to recommend, to Liz's point, as the dream, and what this work group would recommend, but would love to hear from folks about, as she said, the line in the sand when it comes to an approach for essential caregivers. Oh, go ahead.
Just one more, I'm sorry. We can also consider that if you did put a number to how many, we called them resident designated support person, plural, can be plural, that those could be changed by the resident at any time, the same way that you can in family councils. That is the person that you designate, but that can change at any given time. And that would then allow for that person that in the current state, it needs to be my daughter because maybe my husband isn't well, or can be both, so that if one person is not available, the other can also be reached or accessible. But also where are we with making those changes? Because if a resident is designating who they want as their people of choice, they should be allowed to change them as well. And I understand that those people would still have to follow the same guidelines, but can be changed and designated by the resident, new people at their choosing. So that would maybe not necessarily keep us in that. It can be one, it can be two, but in saying if it is two, or if there is a certain number that we agree upon, but that could be changed by the resident at any point.
Karen, I see you've raised your hand. Did you want to respond to that?
I do, and I appreciate Liz's kind of dream that we want, and I'm a firm believer in having meetings with no barriers initially. So I would have to say we don't need to change anything if we have our dream, which is don't mess with resident rights. Residents have the right, it's already in law, state and federal. So let's just not limit it and, talk about what protections their visitors can use, in a public health emergency. But that would be the first line, is that we just want to use what's already in the law. Just like we can't go speeding down the freeway at 150 miles an hour during non-public emergencies, you shouldn't lose your right to do things because of a change in a public health emergency. We can't throw out all the laws just because there's a public health issue. I know we need to protect people. I get that, but if we're going with our dream, let's just not limit visitors. We can ask them to wear their PPE and do their testing and whatever if we have to, or whatever it might be, but let's just not limit them at all.
I'm curious, Karen, if you have a reaction to the thought around the line in the sand, though. Like, what do we consider in a totally unforeseen emergency? We don't know what it is. We don't know how serious it is. What is the baseline thing that we want to make sure must happen in that situation?
If I got to write this policy, I would say give us 30 days to do some figuring out. COVID became such a political hotbed that we almost didn't know from any direction what to listen to. And I don't want this to sound like it's going to sound. I'm not trying to disparage, local public health, but the local public health in my area had really never set foot in a care facility. They didn't know what they were regulating during this when it came to visitors. And so it cost them nothing to say nobody can go in. It cost them nothing to say, only staff. In our area, in most of the facilities, if you have COVID and you're in the isolation area, in my area, they said you can't have a shower because it'll aerosolize it. In other areas, it doesn't happen that way. So we have a lot of opinion, and we all know that's just a problem that's happened with COVID, but let's give it 30 days, and then let's maybe relook at it, but let's not give people 3 years or 2 years of losing all their rights because of what kind of roof is over their head.
Thank you, Karen. Anyone else want to kind of chime in on this concept of the line in the sand, or the bare minimum situation we think would have to happen, understanding that we don't know what emergency it's going to be? Could be a fire emergency, could be public health emergency, there could be operational considerations. What is it that a long-term care facility would be told you have to, at minimum, make sure this happens? Lisa.
I'm in agreement with Karen on this one. I don't think we need a law. We already have the law. We need to ensure that facilities are following the law and that families have ongoing rights to visit with their loved ones. I think if we do want to make a law, the law is that local public health has to be in communication with the advocates that know those buildings. And that could be if it's a fire, if it's an active shooter, it could be a flood, it could be a communicable disease. I don't think we need to expect that local public health officers know everything, but if we mandated that they had to be in communication with the entity that knows that information best, that we give that guidance and let those experts work it out. That would be my hopeful line in the sand.
So rather, in kind of that framework, rather than setting minimums for the state, it would be saying any parameters you set have to be developed in X way. So like in partnership with, yeah.
Yes, and that we before the emergency occurs, we identify who are the experts that should be in communication with other groups. I know for the long-term care ombudsman programs, for those ombudsman programs that were housed within the county, they had a easier time coordinating and working with the local public health officers because those are often also based in the counties. So during a pandemic is not the time when you're going to craft new relationships. So for those programs that already had established relationships, it went a bit better. So that would be what I would say is our proposed law, that you got to talk to the experts whoever those experts are. So if it's a fire, I would assume that local public health should be in communication with the fire department, as opposed to us trying to create arbitrary, this many people, this time of day, this part of the building. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony, I see you raise your hand.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I don't expect this will be the last time I talk today, but I wanted to say, first of all, thank you to the department for setting this up in such an organized way. And you too, Julia, I really appreciate the way this has been formatted. Appreciate all the comments for sure. What Lisa's getting at is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, as someone who had a hand in writing AB 2546, the substantive piece matters about protecting these rights or trying to find the right balance between public health concerns and resident rights concerns, resident quality of life concerns. The other piece is process. I don't think we have anything in 2546 about process. And I think that's what Lisa's getting at is, and I think maybe that we would want an approach that addresses both things. There would be some requirement for consultation on the part of people who would restrict visitation in some way, to consult with the people affected by that, or the people who speak on the people affected by that. That would be nice. And then also so like a consultation piece and maybe a review piece, to have that reviewed by some other source, maybe a statewide agency or something like that. I do have a number of thoughts about the process. I don't want to take us too far in that direction at this point, but I think we should at some point think about what processes would be protective of making sure that we get this as close to right as we possibly can.
Thank you, Tony. Jack, please raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, because he kind of teed up my comments. I think process is important, and then also naming some adjudicating body that convenes and meets immediately once some sort of disaster has been declared. And then the only other piece I would add to that, aside from process, is timeliness. There needs to be some time standards there, and it's care delayed is care denied. So therefore, I think if we are going to draw parameters or lines in the sand, that we put some timeliness standards in there. And I can just talk about my experience as a mental health professional and getting involved in psychiatric holds and things like that. There is a process. It is adjudicated along the way, and there are timeliness standards. So therefore, I think that any legislation we put forth create, an adjudicating body, and that whatever process that we have has timeliness standards. So we're not in a position where it's a care delayed, kind of care denied scenario.
Thank you for that, Jack. Ellen, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, one thing I just want to mention, having worked in a couple different facilities during the pandemic, is that the facility administrator was often the person that was able to make decisions when there were gray areas. And I go back to one of Lisa's comments about the relationship with the ombudsman, with other advocates, with the facilities, working with the organizations that represent them, and really having those relationships cemented before they're needed. So because it's the facility director's license that hangs on the wall, and they ultimately are responsible for what happens there. But they need to hear from many others that have a point of view that needs to be considered.
Thank you, Ellen. Nancy.
Hi, thanks, Ellen and Jack, for those comments. I want to speak just a little bit on what Jack had mentioned or had brought to light. Actually, us residents, we're still trying our best to recover, and some don't know a way out from the tragedy and traumas that came from being kept away from our essential caregivers. So we're still recovering. We're in the recovery process still. And the more time that goes by, the less likely we'll be able to continue to recover from those traumas of sort of being forsaken or felt forsaken.
So I'm going to kind of edit my summary from this section, and just before we move into compassionate care, or we move back into compassionate care, to say, I think coming back to like the core principles we think are important. I'm hearing, you know, we shouldn't, whatever process we have for determining how many people or who you can designate as a visitor should allow you to designate a wide range of people. I heard a couple options for that. I heard people saying, just let people designate as many people as they want. And then perhaps you can say, you know, due to operational safety reasons, you can limit the number who are in the room at one particular moment in time, but allow as many designations as you want. Another option for that was to limit the number of designations, but to allow residents to change those designations as often as they want. Those are kind of two core ways that we could approach what I heard as a core principle of not forcing residents to pick and choose between loved ones, and to be in a situation where there's certain loved ones they can never see because they can't make that designation. That's one principle I heard. Another big one that I heard was thinking through the process through which any parameters on visitation get set, acknowledging that a future emergency may not be predictable. Us sitting in this virtual room today may not be able to name what that emergency would be and what it would look like. So perhaps as we think about what are permissible parameters to visitation, or how do we set parameters, thinking about the process for setting them rather than sitting down right now and saying it should be A, B, C, and D, because we don't know what that emergency is, but perhaps saying they have to be set in X, Y, and Z way to ensure that that fundamental right is achieved. Nancy, you've raised your hand.
I just want to read off what I put in the chat just so no one misses this. I can't choose for someone else to be my mom. No one else can give me the kind of safety feeling, compassion, love that a mom can give. You know, my clergy person can't be my mom, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So I just want to make that point.
Thanks, Nancy. I think that really underscores the piece around not forcing people to pick one or only one. Yes. Great. Okay. We're going to talk a lot more in probably about 20 minutes about different parameters and how we might recommend the parameters for safety, for public health protections be set. But I think we have some really good alignment that we want to recommend an essential caregiver approach. We'll spend a lot more time talking about the parameters around that in our next meeting. Let's talk a little bit about compassionate care, because what we're really trying to do today is get a full kind of list of the areas that this group wants to recommend, and then we can talk through more exactly what the specifics of each recommendation will look like. And so this next section really gets into compassionate care, and whether there are any particular recommendations that this work group wants to put forward that are unique to a compassionate care situation. And reflecting on a lot of what we heard from the work group about the limitations of what the practice of compassionate care has looked like during restricted visitation, that sometimes there were severe time limits or certain numbers of people could be available, could participate in a compassionate care visit. Would love to open it up to this group and just hear from you all where you see some needs for particular recommendations to address the issue of not being able to be with a resident during a moment of crisis. And Nancy, I see you have your hand raised. I'm not sure if that's a new hand raise or from your comment you just made just now. Either way, if you would like to speak, please do so. No, okay. Karen.
I know it's hard because we're a big state, but consistency would be really helpful. You know, if you're in one county, you get these kind of requirements and ability to visit, and if you're in a different county, it's a different one. We really do need statewide consistency. I know that, like, okay, so this county's having a noro outbreak or a whatever outbreak, and that county's not, so that would be different. But when it goes past a certain time frame, at some point we need to be a little bit more consistent about it. And it could be the consistency is, if you have this rate of whatever, it's, you know, it's this visitation plan. But consistency would be really nice. There was, again, a lot of opinion and a lot of personal choices about what to do with these things. And I know it was more than that, but it was just so random, even in areas with very similar COVID situations. So we need consistency.
Thank you, Karen. Nancy, I see you've raised your hand.
Yes, to piggyback off what Karen just said, I was told by our administrator and other folks in management that it was impossible. They specifically used the word impossible to keep up with all of the changing guidance policies, which is another reason why this law is just so important. If that word impossible was used, we witnessed how following the ever-changing guidance just was affecting the residents negatively or on a harmful basis. That's all.
Thank you, Nancy. Nope. Thank you. That's great. Well, that's helpful. I think we are going to spend a little bit of time later in our conversation today for folks, just so you're tracking, talking a little bit about the communication of policies and the implementation of policies once we sort of get a canvas of what we want to recommend. Maitli?
Hi. So compassionate care became such a subjective term. You know, people would decide whether someone needed it. And that's what made it so inconsistent across the board. It had a very broad or a very narrow definition, depending to which part of the pandemic you're in. And if you have a resident designated support person, you have someone in there who has eyes on the person, who knows them very well. We are usually the ones who see the changes in our loved one before caregivers who are paid because they have so many other people to take care of. And during the pandemic, they were very limited in terms of their staff numbers and the pressure on them. It was very difficult. And so having an individual resident designated support person for residents who are able to have one because they have someone, they'll at least have eyes on them that can say, look, I know this person and they need compassionate care. And the way that I understood compassionate care was, you know, if you have a resident designated support person, you have social support, you have a lot of the issues that, you know, like when people were crying at one point, they were able to get compassionate care. They didn't all the time, but technically it was written that they could. But end of life can't be, oh, she's on her last day, or she might be on her last day, because nobody really knows, except I don't even know who knows. I can't tell you, but nobody really knows when that last breath will be taken. And so for compassionate care to be timed, it was very unfair. But I can tell you that if you have a resident designated support person in there, they can tell you when they should see their family and have more access to everyone who needs to be with them at end of life, if we're talking end of life specifically.
That's helpful, thank you. And so I think that gets a little bit to how we define and how we identify the need for a compassionate care visit, and not necessarily leaving that entirely up to the facility, but having, to your point, Maitli, the opportunity for the resident designated support person to actually identify those scenarios and lift them up too. I'm seeing some questions about like, why would we need to consider compassionate care? Well, I mean, first of all, it's going to be the, this decision and consensus of this work group, whether to lift up a particular compassionate care recommendation. So if the work group does not think one needs to be put forward, that's kind of the decision of this work group. I think the piece I will raise is thinking about the line in the sand situation, which is acknowledging that in certain states of emergencies, there may be certain types of restrictions that are set for public protection, and we'll spend some more time in a minute talking about what those might be. If you're in a situation where there's limitation on, for example, the number of simultaneous essential caregivers who can be in a space with someone, does this work group want to make a recommendation that the number of simultaneous visitors in a compassionate care situation should look different, for example? That would be where the compassionate care recommendation would come in. Any additional thoughts from folks about a compassionate care recommendation? Lisa?
I feel like this one is one of those slippery slopes. If we carve this in, it gives a reason why you couldn't be allowed in. So only if you have these special words and you know how to say, this person, I need this person because they are my compassionate care, person. It becomes a carve out for why so-and-so can't come in. And if we get to, well, it's only end of life. I think my most traumatizing COVID call was, they won't let me in to see my mom unless I agree to pull the plug and take her off life support, because then she will be in fact dying. That's just an unfathomable thing. And I don't want us to ever go back to that world. So I would just assume not. I would just assume that we have the right to visit with people and that we do our best to enforce a way that makes sense safely for the residents and for the operation of the facility.
Thank you for that comment. George?
Hi, thank you. I think for compassionate care, it depends on what's afforded for that relative to, let's say, like a base recommendation. So if the base recommendations are, there's a lot of latitude and you don't necessarily need to distinguish compassionate care because the base recommendation is satisfactory, then you may not need to distinguish. But that really depends though on what the base recommendations are. I mean, I was hearing earlier in the discussion that essentially, pretty much allow all visitation as long as the visitors are doing the same things that the staff are doing. So if that's the case, then what's the distinguishment for a compassionate care situation? So it just really depends on a relative basis what that involves, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
Thank you.
I'm hearing we essentially just need to define further what are the public health protections.
Yeah, because you may not
distinguish. Yes.
You may not need to distinguish if there's so much latitude in just on a general basis. That what's the point? But if there's not less latitude on the general recommendations, then you may need to do some more distinguishing for compassionate care. So it just depends.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Thank you. Nancy, I see you have your hand raised.
I want to apologize if I'm taking up anyone else's time to be able to speak. I seem to be chiming in quite a lot on this issue, but the definitions of both are sort of in my own personal experience and from what I've witnessed here in my facility, there's and looking at all of the numbers of people who have died not due to having COVID directly, failure to thrive, to me, it's all end of life. It's all end of life visits or potentially saving people from being at that point. You speak of, everyone speaks of this fine line, but there's also a fine line between having that essential caregiver come in and end of life. And I can talk about my own personal story if anyone wants to connect, but there's a need for definition, but as it stands now, it's one and the same for me.
Thank you for sharing that. And please do not apologize for speaking up. You are experiencing this. You are a resident living in a long-term care facility, and your input is extremely valuable for this work group. Melody, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just a couple of notes and kind of underscoring what a couple of others have said about just the knowledge of the loved one by a bio or chosen family member. I remember being on a very landline, very bad landline call with my husband, and I'm the one who detected he had pneumonia, not the staff who were working with him directly. So I think, there's that viewpoint. And then also when we're talking about compassionate care, if we're looking at policies and procedures that are going to cover visitation, no matter what the person's status is, doesn't that already include compassionate care? So, I'm wondering, are we, looking at another category that's not really another category because it's already encompassed in the main content of the subject matter that we're discussing? And then third, there's, when it's compassionate care, when it's not compassionate care. And I don't see the slide up, but I think it's maybe the next slide down asks the question, I'm sorry, I'm looking at another monitor right now. Under what circumstances do you feel that that essential caregiving and compassionate care can be enabled? And kind of counter with that, of what circumstances do we feel that essential caregiving and compassionate care can be disabled? Shouldn't they always be enabled?
So I appreciate you raising that slide, Melody, because I wonder if we actually go there next in our conversation. Apologies, I have a cold, so folks can't hear that. I'm losing my voice a little bit. Yeah, I think that's a great call, Melody, that it really, and to George's point earlier as well, it sort of all depends how we define some of the parameters and how we define the essential caregiver, then what additional elements we need to consider. So perhaps we go there, and then we can come back to this conversation. Perhaps we may not have time today, but in a future conversation, we come back to looking at these additional considerations around rights to see if we feel there's additional specific recommendations to be made there based on where we land in the public health protections parameters section. So I'm going to take us there now. We have about an hour left in our discussion. And what we really want to talk about in this section is understanding, I think we're coming to this with a mindset of enabling visitation that we've talked about for the past hour and some. And we want to talk a little bit about what are the measures that we also need to consider in terms of protecting public health. And I know this is an area that it's not easy to talk about. It's very complex. And so really encourage folks to come, especially for the next few minutes, with a mindset of putting things on the table of what is it that we do need to be able to protect public health that we can consider and make sure we weave into visitation from a really productive standpoint. So if we go to the next slide, we have a few questions we want to invite folks to weigh in on here. And And we're gonna come back to our additional categories of visitation to talk about, but I think it'll be helpful to do a little bit more conversation here first. So we really want to invite the group to put, with a public health lens for a moment, to really think through some of the public health considerations for visitation policies. And a few core questions we have listed on this slide. I'm going to read them while folks kind of think through their comments here. The first is, we really want to think through, how do we strike a balance that would give public health professionals flexibility to address unexpected situations during a state of emergency? And here, I really want to remind folks of comments made by a few different people in the work group that we are not making policy recommendations for COVID-19 in April of 2022. We are making policy recommendations for states of emergencies unknown to us in the future. A couple kind of additional questions to think about. Under what circumstances do you feel that essential caregiving and compassionate care can be enabled? And what circumstances might they potentially be impacted? Thinking about the range of public health emergencies we might face. And then this last question is one that's been raised by a few different folks to really dig into this idea of, are there specific situations in which staff and residents might need to follow different safety protocols to protect public health? Or might we be able to set a standard that, as long as there's parity there, we can move forward with types of visitation? So we want to encourage a really productive and focused conversation in on these questions to really identify what are the public health protections that we need to think about for this work group. Tony, I see you have your hands raised, so we'll go to you first, but I also know we have some folks from our public health professionals on the work group who are also prepared to speak to this. So I'll ask them to speak to this as well in a moment, but Tony.
Yeah, thanks. 2 points. First of all, going back to, I think it was slide 23, where we had the scale and there was a balance there between resident rights and public health. And I understand why you do it that way. I mean, those are the big considerations we're worried about, and we're just trying to simplify it to a PowerPoint slide. But one thing that I think we've overlooked a lot is that they're not always antagonistic with one another, that having access to visitation in many ways improves public health, that at least the health of the people being visited, and in some cases the visitors as well. So I don't see them as necessarily two sides of that scale all the time, but I understand why it was set up that way, but just wanted to raise that point. And then the other issue is, I've had a hard time coming up with a scenario, and I would really appreciate maybe some input from public health officials or other public safety representatives of a scenario where a resident designated support person could be treated differently from a staff person. I just have a hard time figuring out a way where that designated support person is going to provide less in terms of quality of care and quality of life to that person than the average staff person.
Thank you, Tony, for that question. I see we have Nancy who's raised her hand, so we'll go to Nancy next.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Juliet. Also, I wanted to talk about the shortage of staffing, not just in the nursing homes, but also in public health departments, and also in the ombudsman departments. There's a shortage of staff in all of those places, and having an essential caregiver to come in and sort of assist with those roles as well would be very, very helpful, extremely helpful. It's to the detriment of our health and well-being. And then to that third bullet point there, do you see situations where staff and visitors might need to follow different safety protocols to protect public health? Perhaps just not going from room to room.
Thank you, Nancy.
You bet.
Makes sense. All right, I want to open it up. I know we have a few public health folks. I see Jaylene's raised her hand, so I will go there.
Hi, Jaylene Richards with Solano Public Health, and I'm also a representative of County Health Executives Association of California. And thank you for having this call and allowing time for us to share. You know, I've mentioned on this call probably and past calls that public health officials need to have their flexibility and their toolbox during a given emergency. And what we found with COVID-19 is that it was a very unusual emergency and there wasn't a lot known about it. When there's emergencies in other emergencies like fires, neurovirus, tuberculosis, there's a pretty good playbook on how to respond to that emergency. But COVID-19 was very unusual, and health officers needed to have the powers and the tools to respond to it at a given time. The minimal necessary restrictions need to be used during a given emergency, and clear communication about the emergency needs to be provided to the public, to the family members, to the caregivers, and others. And I agree with what a lot has been said about how why this action is being taken, how it impacts visitation possibly, and what's the timetable that is needed, and when will it be reassessed should be part of that clear communication. One thing, Solano worked very, very closely with our long-term care facilities here in our county. We have an infection prevention team, and we are not demobilizing it. We're going to keep that team running. And we think that can help long-term care facilities now and in the future in responding to emergencies. One thing that we want to keep going is having a video for family members on how to visit their loved ones safely, especially during an emergency. Teaching long-term care facilities about zoning within a facility, having a red zone for those who are experiencing the disease, a green zone for those who are okay, and a yellow zone for those who may be in that iffy situation that we kept on having during COVID. And some zones would require full PPE. We talked a lot about compassionate care and visiting, and just visiting in general. And I think we learned a lot from this past emergency, and that we can move forward, that there could be electronic visitation, time limited visitation if needed, education about PPE, how to use it, how to have a successful visit with it. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, different protocols for employees versus visitors. Again, if there is an unknown disease, there might need to be different protocols in some instances. And I know that during COVID, healthcare workers, for example, could get the vaccine very, very early, but the general public couldn't. So you wouldn't want to not have visitors because they didn't have their vaccine per se. But there could be different rules for different folks based on the situation. That's all I have to say, and I'm sure I'll add in more later. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate you raising all of those pieces and sharing the kind of core elements from a public health perspective that are critical here. Catherine, I see you've raised your hand.
Thanks so much, Juliet. I guess I thought those comments brought to light. I appreciated your earlier comments about we're not designing a policy for 2020, but yet whatever we're doing is influenced by that for the reasons that Jaylyn said, which is it was something new and different. So I still think sort of understanding what we lived through during that period of time and what we might be able to do different and better is really an important part of that. So if you thought about, what Jaylene was saying, which was maybe there have to be limitations, I think we have to still start from the place that there are consequences for people if they're not allowed visitors that we did not fully take into account and maybe didn't appreciate. And that we can't end back up ever again in a place where people did not have a visitor for a year or sometimes longer. And so if there is something so extreme and there's no way to protect people, it has to be more time limited with a careful, thorough, ongoing review so that we're not jeopardizing people's health in other ways. So I think the past foretells sometimes what the future is, and we have to learn from that, or we're going to end up making the same mistakes that we made the last time. So thank you.
Yep. Comments very well taken, and certainly why we spent a lot of time talking about COVID-19 at our first meeting. I think one thing I'll just raise before I go to the next person who's raised their hand, to your point, Catherine, is learning from COVID, knowing that it can last a long time, knowing it can be unexpected, to Jaylene's point, what are our, as Liz Fuller was saying earlier in the meeting, line in the sand. It needs to at least be this. And this is how you determine any kind of parameters, so that we are coming from a place of a stronger baseline next in any future situation. And we know what it, at minimum, even in a really unexpected situation, needs to be informed by COVID. Nancy, you raised your hand.
You took most of the words out of my mouth, Juliet.
Oh.
And the prior
Apologies.
speaker too. Yeah. Stay out of my head. That's my personal space. This is not about taking away the toolboxes from public health officials at all, by any means. We greatly, greatly appreciate and have a need for public health departments, whether it be federal, state, or local. Again, like Juliet and the prior speaker just spoke on, we need a start. And there's a lot of survivor's guilt that my neighbors and I talk about openly on a regular basis to heal, because we didn't speak up about this specific issue sooner as we watch body bags go by us every day. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for sharing, Nancy. Ellen, do you have your hand raised?
Yes. Hi, I just wanted to mention that I thought that public health, I'm from San Diego, and I believe they worked extremely hard. We had tremendous communication and a long-term care work group that was specific to issues coming up in facilities. I think the most important thing that I take away is the communication. One of the big challenges was trying to figure out what you were operating under, what AFL, what PIN, where were you getting your direction? Was it current? Were you doing what it was that public health was requiring at the time? So towards the future, I would just say to try to improve that, to figure out who is on first and who is providing the instructions, so that at every level, people know what it is that is of that moment. I know it's really hard. COVID, looking back at COVID, it was like being in a crisis unit or a MASH unit. But I think aspirationally trying to figure out, yes, the state public health has jurisdiction. No, the local public health has jurisdiction. Here is the most recent guidance that you need to pay attention to and how it impacts residents and others.
Thank you, Ellen. Karen, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so, again, going back to the toolbox, and I really appreciate Jaylene being willing to be on here and help out with, how do we find whatever kind of balance we can find, because, we don't want people sick. We didn't want people going out in those bags, but, we also wanted access, and that's a hard razor to ride. But we have to be cautious with those toolboxes that we're giving out, because there was a lot of freedoms that were lost, and we all understand the whys behind most of it. But for instance, in one area, paid ombudsmen could go into facilities, but volunteers were told by local public health that they couldn't go in. And I absolutely guarantee there is no difference with COVID whether we get a paycheck or not. And so that was hard to hear that was even a requirement. But the other thing that we've heard about was, pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, our ombudsman office, and I know several others, were part of helping counties write standard operating procedures, the SOPs for how to handle pandemic flu, or how to handle a fire, an earthquake, or whatever. And then being told when the emergency hit that they'd thrown the entire playbook out. It was gone. Then we were starting all fresh, and every protection that was put in, every plan was out the window, and we were starting all new. We need to make sure whatever recommendations and whatever becomes eventual policy, that we can't just toss it all out. Obviously you got to revise it for the incident, but you can't just throw out everything and then lose all those relationships and, attendance at meetings and being part of the plan, part of the, at the table. And we can't have people kept out of facilities simply because of their paycheck status. That makes no scientific sense, and it's not a toy, and it's not a toolbox that anyone should be allowed to wield. There's plenty of things that needed to happen, but that one just didn't make sense. And I don't want Jaylene or anyone else to have to defend those choices. That's not what today is about. I just want to point out, when we're giving out tools that affect people's lives and their freedoms and their ability to see their loved ones, we have to be very careful with that, what power we're giving out.
Thank you, Karen. Jaylene, I know you have your hand raised, and I know Anissa Davis is also prepared to speak a little bit. Let's go to Jaylene, since you have your hand raised first.
Anissa could go first and then I'll go.
Okay, sure. Anissa, would you like to?
Hi, yes, thank you. A lot of these things have already been said, but I'll just, a little bit of repetition. Hi, I'm Anissa Davis. I'm the City Health Officer for the City of Long Beach, and also the President of the California Conference of Local Health Officers, or CCLHO. And I just wanted to thank the group for this opportunity to share some comments. The California's local health officers are physicians that are appointed either by the County Board of Supervisors or by the City Council in the cases of the 3 city health jurisdictions, which are Berkeley, Pasadena, and Long Beach. And we're actually required by California Health and Safety Code. That's what, empowers us and gives us our authority, and requires us to take actions as necessary to prevent the spread of disease in any setting within our jurisdiction. So whether that's workplaces or schools, shelters, special events, and long-term care facilities and acute care hospitals. And a lot of the times these actions are often, put forth in the form of health officer orders. We do take multiple variables into consideration, and I think when we're working to prevent and control the spread of disease and protect our community, and so sometimes that can affect, the consistency between different jurisdictions, because we're responding to the makeup of our own jurisdiction and what things are looking like in our jurisdiction. It is also can affect sometimes, depending on what's going on, the type of recommendations that you make within a particular facility, to address kind of when would something be different for a resident versus a staff versus a visitor or a support person. It could be like during the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have enough PPE. And then there's certain requirements in order to wear certain types of PPE, like N95 masks. So it's just an example of things that we take into consideration, as well as the risk of the disease in a particular population, how prevalent the disease is in the community, how it's spread, what kind of protective measures are in place and available, and then the risk of severe outcomes in certain populations. I just want to reiterate what Jaylene said, that our orders are, we are bound to use the least restrictive practices. And we are subject, all of our orders are subject to due process, and they can be challenged in court. We must operate consistent with the United States and California constitutions. And in case law, precedent has really provided the onus that these orders should be really narrowly tailored and use the least restrictive, reasonable means of preventing disease. And so just, also reiterating that we need to retain our flexible authority. We don't know what the next disaster could be. It could be communicable disease that's spread by air or touch. It could be a radiological disaster. It could be a chemical spill. And so, having the greatest flexibility also with the constitutional and legal constraints that are in place is really important as we, move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I see next we have Nancy who's raised her hand, and then we have Cassie with CDPH. So Nancy.
Just really quick, I didn't realize how dummy proof this needed to be. If there's, if the building's crumbling down and firefighters are in the building and doing all that stuff, I don't believe that essential caregivers would want to run in to do firefighters' job. Also, I do believe that this is a constitutional issue. And then my next point is that I think that there's a lot of credentialism going in to these thoughts and maybe questions, maybe not the questions, but you don't need a degree to see that someone needs TLC of any kind. So that's all.
Thank you, Nancy. Cassie, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, hi, Cassie Dunham, I'm Deputy Director at Center for Healthcare Quality with CDPH, and I've been very intently listening and just waiting to, really consume what everybody else's thoughts are. Broadly, I want to just say that, that anytime that there's a consideration for suspending visitation, it is certainly a very sensitive issue, one that we don't take lightly. I don't think anybody in the period where visitation was suspended could anticipate how long that was going to transpire. And I think certainly looking back, there's obvious lessons learned that we can take away and put into place from the center and department perspective. But I do just want to echo some of the comments that Anissa made, that we can't necessarily forecast specific nuances that might come with a future emergency. And so having the flexibility to be as nimble as possible to mitigate any risk to resident safety in those moments is really imperative. And we were working very closely with local public health officers and trying to do the least restrictions possible throughout the pandemic. And I think that that's certainly what we would want to take forward and continue, and to try to be the least restrictive in anything solutions that we might put into place. So I'm really happy to be part of this conversation today and learning about the different perspectives and the sensitivities that we need to be mindful of going forward. And I think that this group will come up with some really great solutions and recommendations for us to take into future consideration. So thank you for the opportunity to join today.
Thank you for joining us, Cassie, and for your comments. Melody.
Thank you, Cassie, for your comments and the input. It's really important to hear that feedback. And as we're on topic of least restrictive and so forth, so many times the facilities in and of themselves were saying, we don't have to go by what DPH is telling us or CMH is telling us. We can kind of make up our own rules. And it also, while we're on the topic of least restrictive and moving forward, and I liked that term of Cassie, or the concept of what we're going to be doing future forward, because when I'm hearing least restrictive, that if you know, and it makes us wonder what least restrictive being the legal standard. Why was the most restrictive used in practice? And I think in agreement with the comment that you made at the end, Cassie, too, what can be prevented from that happening in the future? And just wanted to put that thought out there. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Melanie. We have a hand raised, long-term care facility access member, so I can't see your name, but if you know who you are, please take yourself off mute to comment.
Yeah, Juliet, sorry. Hi, I'm Claire Ramsey. I'm Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Social Services. Just want to also join in the conversation that's happening and really have been in listening mode as Mark mentioned at the beginning. I think it's been really valuable, as Cassie also said, for the departments to be able to be part of this work group and to really sit and listen to all the different perspectives that are coming forward, and for us to really think deeply, both about lessons learned, which I know a lot of us have talked about, kind of what's going forward, and also what it looks like to operationalize all these pieces, given that it is such a dynamic environment. So I hope people appreciate that the departments really are trying to listen and think through what all these different component parts would mean in practice, given that the scope of what we're talking about is so broad. And, you know, appreciate that, you know, we have this very specific set of circumstances that happen in COVID, which could, hopefully will never repeat themselves in our lifetime. But, you know, people may be, again, thinking about the things that go along with communicable diseases around PPE and you know, how many visitors at a room at a time, those type of things. But also us, when we do think about things that might be more natural disasters or, you know, an earthquake, a fire, where really there are significant reasons that people wouldn't, maybe we would say here on this call in the calmness, oh, nobody's going to go into a building when there's a fire, but just making sure that we're thinking through the fact that like maybe somebody would think they need to do that. And so just making sure we're being thoughtful about like the what ifs there, and that we both are really protecting residents' rights to visitation, and also thinking through sometimes people may not be acting how we might all be thinking, 50 of us might be thinking on a call today when it's calm. So just acknowledging that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate those comments. Lisa, I see you've raised your hand.
I want to start off by saying thank you to the public health officers that are on this call, and to really hear my intent with this, because I don't mean to attack any of you, because the fact that you're on this call makes you different than many of your peers. I don't know that I'm as big a fan of local control, because I think what that felt like from an outside advocacy perspective was 58 different kings and queens that got to make rules for their local areas, but those laws were being enforced by the licensing agency, which was really just two, right? Community care licensing, or the California Department of Public Health. And so those surveyors and analysts that were in the facilities, I think that local control and the 58 different rules that could be applied wasn't as helpful during an emergency. So I'm going to go back to what I was saying at the very beginning about the need for local public health to be in communication with the experts, and those experts already know what the rules and the laws are. And maybe that would have helped to have promoted the least restrictive instead of what many of us saw as being the most restrictive out of fear. So again, I'm saying this not as any kind of an attack on those that are representing agencies here today, because you're here, right? You want to be a part of this conversation. I wish we could have brought a few of those other folks to this call. So.
Thank you for those comments. Karen.
Sorry, my phone was ringing. I wanted to kind of, I know we're nearing the end of this, so it's probably a little late for this, but we were just talking about, you know, fires and people running in or out of buildings or not. And we have had situations where it was families and neighbors who did go into those buildings to get people out. So I think what we're talking about here is an infectious disease type public health emergency. We're not talking a fire or an earthquake, because in those situations, we do need those families to come and help out a lot of times. Even in an evacuation, the facilities, you know, with our current staffing ratios in every facility, there's never going to be enough staff to help really truly evacuate people safely. So there are going to be families and friends who show up and neighbors to help. It's really the infectious public diseases where the public health is going to have time. CDPH is going to have time. CCL will have time to write visitor restrictions or not, to write public health policy about it. There, you know, if we get a Sonoma area level fire where it blows through on 60-mile-an-hour winds, no one's sitting down to write a policy about visits. That may come eventually, perhaps, but I doubt it. It's really a public health emergency where someone else could get sick because of a choice somebody else makes. And so I think we need to maybe look at limiting it to not those immediate public health, like the smoke is bad and we're all going to have a lung problem, which did kind of happen here and everywhere else when we had big fires. But it's not those. That's not where we're going to see these limitations, because we've had those forever. We've had earthquakes, we've had, you know, all that. It's COVID brought this out, and now we've got to deal with what do we do the next time there's an infectious problem.
Thank you, Karen, for those comments. Anissa, I see you've raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to respond and just, you know, appreciate other folks' feedback, and that, you know, I just want to echo that, yes, there was a lot of confusion on the different levels of, you know, locus of control. And so I think that was, I could see how that bred a lot of confusion, but there were a lot of things that were outside of the local public health department's control. And I think that was confusing too. Like a lot of things were coming from federal, and then the state was interpreting, and then, you know, locals could work within that. And I appreciate so I just want to say that I could see that causes a lot of confusion. I think for everybody involved, it was causing a lot of confusion, there were a lot of different areas of people making rules. And then I also just wanted to say that you know, we were trying, and I, you know, to speak for the local health officers, I know that we weren't always there, like we've said, that there were lessons learned. And I just want to say that we were trying to be the least restrictive. I understand, like, looking at it from like your resident or this other, you know, situation or perspective, that it looks like the most restrictive. However, we were trying to be the least restrictive within all of the variables and things that were happening, and then all of the unknowns. So I know that it may not have been implemented that way or come off that way, but that was really our intention, because we realized that caregivers, you know, support staff, family members are just a very vital part of residents' health, just like they are in all of the community. Social supports are important in all of the community. So, you know, I just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
Thank you for those comments. I'd love it if we could go to the next slide and maybe start moving us into, and I know we're not going to have a full conversation about this today, but would love to tee up this conversation for our next meeting. So one of the things that was talked about very early on in our conversation today, as I think we all, the group really aligned behind the concept of ensuring that residents can name anyone that they would like to be able to see them, to be someone who can see them. Understanding that there may be operational considerations for having 20 people in the room at one time. So what are some of the baselines that we would want to set or that we would want to recommend in this work group to ensure that people are getting access to the people that they love in a way that is that respects their personal right and promotes their personal health and well-being to be able to have access to their loved ones. What we've done here is we've listed out a few different ways that states have thought about this. And I think Blanca noted earlier in the conversation today, California doesn't always do things exactly the way other states do, but we can learn from these ways and think about them. There's a few different approaches that other states have taken to say something might be happening in terms of a communicable disease in the community, something might be happening in terms of an emergency in the community, and this is how you might allow for certain types of public health protections that could have an impact on visitation. So in the first and we've categorized them a little bit here for the sake of conversation. In the first category, there is a general approach of saying, we established some baseline visitation rights. So this concept of being able to have access to an essential caregiver. And a facility or a state can say, or a county can say, those caregivers have to follow certain types of safety protocols. And so that can be grounded to the policies set by an organization like the CDC or CMS or a public health commissioner. It can be tied to the protocols that are established for staff. So that's one that's been stated a lot. What that might look like is saying you can name 20 people to come visit you, and they can visit you as long as they follow the same safety protocols as staff, or they follow the same safety protocols as those set by CDC or CMS. That's one bucket that we might consider. And if folks want to start reacting to things they think sound like a good approach for California, I would welcome those in the chat. In the middle category, we have allowing facilities to set permissible parameters for visitations if needed to protect public health. And so in some situations, states have set very specific parameters. They have said, facilities are allowed, and we talked about this earlier, are allowed to limit the number of simultaneous visitors, but then some states have said, but it can't be lower than the number X. Some states have said facilities can limit the hours of visitation for operational reasons, but they can't be less than X amount of hours, or it can't be less than some visitation hours on the weekend, or whatever that might look like. And in some situations, states have said, we can limit visitation to certain locations. And we heard some feedback on that earlier today about some drawbacks of that approach. There are some states that have, and all of these state policies are available on the long-term care facility access policy website if you want to go in and read more about them. And if there are particular areas we're interested in exploring more and learning more about how different states do it, we can pull those forward in our next meeting. There are states that have established kind of a reasonable standard. So essentially, in their policies, they say that long-term care any limitations to visitation rights must be the least restrictive. And in some scenarios, facilities have to provide the public health reason for a specific limitation. And then in the last column here, you can see there is an approach of establishing a process where facilities can request time-bound lockdowns to protect public health. And so this essentially says, and I think other folks have mentioned this concept of a time-boundedness. If there is a situation you can't anticipate, it can't continue forever. If there's a serious limitation on visitation, setting a limit on how long that can happen for, and some states have done that. I see, Melody, your note about, we can use a combination of these measures. These are just different approaches leveraged by different states, and welcome any reactions or thoughts around any of these. I see Melody put in a comment in the chat about looking at the original version of the language in the Resident Designated Support Act that is included in the summary that Caroline just dropped in the chat, if folks want to look at that. And I'm opening it up at this point for any thoughts. Apologies, I'm losing my voice a little bit. Any thoughts on the approaches that we might consider? It does not have to be just what's limited to this slide here. This is just to get people thinking. If any of these are approaches we want to explore further in our upcoming meeting, or if there are any additional thoughts on how to think about, allowing for an unexpected public health situation and thinking through what might be some ways in which we put guardrails and rules around how we think about visitation impacts for public health protections. Seeing a lot of alignment around A. Karen, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I put in my comments that, I definitely prefer A with a requirement, but more importantly, I definitely prefer no limits for visitors. If staff can go in, then visitors should be able to go in. Maybe not as many as we had like at the beginning or before COVID, but every resident should have an access to a visitor. And if there's enough PPE for staff, there should be at least 1 or 2 pieces of PPE for those visitors. So that would be, the line in the sand. That'd be my preference. But if we have to do something, and we do, then A would probably be it. But I don't think we should let facilities individually decide to limit visitation. That some facilities, that's going to be a big problem, and there'll be more limits than we need. And they don't always tell residents what their rights are when it comes to visitation. So we can't really count on them and say, well, we'd like this, but you can do all these things. They never, that doesn't happen too often.
Well, let me perhaps restate the concept of letting facilities allow limitations to actually, are there ways that we want to think about putting recommendations on the bare minimum that facilities have to allow? So it's not necessarily establishing rules that you can limit X, Y, and Z. It's actually to say you at minimum have to provide this.
Well, a lot of people know my frustration with guidance that has come out during COVID, and really any time, when you get guidance from, whoever, CDPH, CCL, CDMS, there's a lot of shoulds and coulds and may, and I hate those words because they're permissive, and people are going to do whatever's easiest for them within those words. So if you say permit facilities, they're going to say, well, I'm permitted to not. I'm permitted to limit instead of saying you must. And so we have to watch what words we use.
Thank you, Karen. That's helpful. So it might be thinking instead of saying you can limit simultaneous visitors, but you have to allow at least 2 at once. The policy recommendation there might actually just be facilities must allow 2 at once. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
at
really.
Least.
I mean, I don't have an issue with saying only 1 person per resident at a time, except in certain circumstances, like, end of life. At least they still have a visitor, and it doesn't have to be the same visitor each time. And that gives that little bit more, public health emergency where things are spreading. It helps spread people out, and, all the stuff we learned to do with public, with COVID. So I don't mean they have to have 2 people. They just need to have access to more than 1 visitor. But you can still be singly each time.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm seeing a lot of echoing of Tony's comments in the chat. Tony, I wonder if you'd be willing to just share those verbally.
Sure. It was just expressing big misgivings about the idea of facilities being able to restrict visitation ad hoc or as they see fit. What my experience during the first 2 years of COVID was that there were many nursing homes that just proved to be totally inhospitable to the idea of visitation, even when they were being ordered to allow visitation to some extent. That was not my experience with assisted living, where I thought there were significant efforts made from the provider point of view to try to expand visitation, but nursing homes, it was a whole nother story. And I think if they've got discretion, a lot of not all, but a lot of facilities would use that in violation of the spirit of what we're talking about here today.
Thank you for that comment, Tony. I see we have a few hands raised. I'm going to take a few of them, and then I do want to acknowledge we have a few folks that have joined us today who are not part of the work group, who are joining as members of the public. If you have any comments you want to share, please feel free to raise your hand at this time, and we will go to comments from the public in just a moment. Nancy, you've raised your hand.
And now we've got a lot of people, so I'll make this quick. It's sort of an unspoken belief that visitors or family members or essential caregivers essentially are going to come in and cause trouble. They bring grief and they bring additional workloads, things like that. So please, please, folks, take that into consideration. And it's my experience that facilities will use their ability, if given so, the right to shut her down, so to speak. We just recently had a new admission for a long-term care residency here, and because we were short-staffed on all 3 stations, very short-staffed on all 3 stations, the nursing home administrator decided to say, well, this person may have come into contact with COVID at some point, without any proof whatsoever, and they were able to shut our facility into lockdown. We were told to stay in our rooms, stay in our beds, don't come out, no visitors allowed, because they were short-staffed. And one person could possibly have come into contact with COVID outside. That's all.
Thank you, Nancy. Derek.
I think as a former owner operator of skilled nursing assisted living, we lived through the first 2 years with a lot of inconsistencies in terms of how different states agencies asked, us to look at this specific issue. So my key point is to make sure that it has to be carefully developed and there's consistency among all the state agencies in overseeing this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. George?
Thank you. To kind of ease some people's angst, speaking as someone who represents at least the smaller facilities, certainly we don't represent all the facilities, but our members, I don't think, want the burden of establishing these parameters. So, I know there's a lot of support more for A, and that's probably where we're at. I think echoing some of the just comments now, I think the biggest issue for our members was just the, some of the inconsistencies in the guidance, the lack of parity with between visitors and staff, the fact that residents could go outside the facility and pretty much do most of what they want and then come back in, but they couldn't have visitors in the facility. So a lot of just confusing guidance, conflicting guidance sometimes, and also rapidly evolving guidance. And so I think that was, some of the issues from the facility perspective. But certainly, I can speak for a lot of our members, the smaller facilities, when I say that, I don't think we want to be the ones setting the parameters, but we do, and part of the problem with that too is, one of the principles of the group is parity. So if you have different parameters set by facilities, then you can have a lot of inconsistency across the board, which is difficult to manage in its own right. So that's all I'll say about that.
Thank you, George. Heather.
Hi, thanks. I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said in this last section, but I agree with these comments. The assisted living communities work really hard to maintain and to achieve visitation. Under B, I think when I first read this, I interpreted it differently than maybe others when they first saw it, is I didn't see it as the facilities creating, their own emergency plans, but instead, based on the experience we just all lived through the last few years, it was how are we going to manage and implement the instructions we've gotten from the various, government entities that were putting out the guidance. If we have to screen people at the door, observe visits to make sure that they're 6 feet apart and people wear a mask. There were all these other things you had to do in order to have a visit. You had to check vaccine status. You had to train people how to put on PPEs, that those things had to be managed in order to be in compliance. So I just wanted to mention that, and also respond to something that came up in the chat a little bit earlier, and even one of the bullets here that about requiring facilities to establish or follow the least restrictive. The rule was, and still is, facilities are required to follow the most restrictive. So when state, local, federal guidance differed, there was any conflict, facilities had to follow the most restrictive, even if it was in the unwinding phase, and some level of experts had lessened the rules. If your specific rule hadn't yet caught up, you still had to follow the most restrictive. So that felt bad for everybody. I mean, that just did feel wrong.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks.
We're coming to the end of our time. I do want to turn to our folks who've joined us who are not part of the work group, but have joined us from the public, and just see if there's any comments from folks who've joined us today before we wrap up. Teresa, you raised your hand. I think someone on the CDA comms team is going to help you come off of mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I've been typing my comments into Q&A all along, so I won't use up any more of your time. I've participated by typing my comments into Q&A. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Teresa, and both. I'll also just note that both for the Q&A and the chat, we do re-review those after the call as well. So
yeah,
all of that, we will be looking through all of that. Thank you.
I wanted to say I'm a retired nursing home physician, and I also, my mother died I took her out of the nursing home to die, but it was a nightmare reassuring her at the end of her life that we had not abandoned her. It was horrible. And I still have basically PTSD from that. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for that comment. I think with that, this is going to bring us to the end of our conversation today. I just want to summarize a few core things before we move on. So I heard from today a few core principles we can move forward and then begin to define much more deeply in our next meeting. The first was really some very strong alignment that we want to ensure that members are able to designate individuals who can visit them, and that designation process does not force them to have a very small number of people who can visit for a very extended period of time. So we want to think about the number, we want to think about the choice, we want to think about the time period for that element of it. What I also heard is we need to spend some additional time thinking through what are some of the baseline requirements of what a facility, every facility would have to do. And so we're not leaving it up to the facilities to determine, but what every facility has to at least allow. And that way facilities are not setting individual policies around things that are undefined and not specified, but rather we're kind of setting a baseline. So I want to encourage folks to think about that between now and our next meeting. And then I think the last, and we'll have a whole conversation around that our next meeting. And then I think our last piece will be, once we've talked through what it looks like to define that resident designated support person, right? What it looks like to set some core minimums and processes around things like safety protocols. We'll then also kind of have a conversation about whether we might consider any additional considerations for things like compassionate care, offsite visitation, and services that might not be accounted for in the other two categories as we address this. So that will be the focus of our next conversation. With that, if we go to the next slide. And I think, Brandy, I'm handing it back to you to prepare us for meeting 3. Is that right, Brandy?
Yes, so thank
Great.
you all for coming for the next meeting, meeting 3. We want you to know it will be on Wednesday, July 12th at 12:30. CDA will circulate the agenda at least 10 days in advance, and we will do our best to get the materials out 5 days before that meeting. We encourage you all to review the materials prior to the meeting and consult with other people in your organizations as needed. The materials will be listed on the CDA website, which somebody from the team will drop into the chat. I also want to let you all know that we will post the chat transcripts and video recording from this meeting on the website as soon as we can. And I just want to thank you all again for participating in this important work and sharing your thoughts and experiences. We look forward to continued collaboration with all of you on the Long-Term Care Facility Access Policy Workgroup over the next few months. If you have questions, you can email LTCFA Policy Workgroup at aging.ca.gov, which we can also drop into the chat. And again, just to thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.